Chapter 29. Vivian was surprised to discover that she enjoyed the opera Carmen at the Met even more than she had enjoyed the Philharmonic at Carnegie Hall. Even though the opera was sung in French, it was easy enough to understand what was going on, even had she not had a program that explained the plot. The music was very melodious, and the whole opera had a modern feel to it, and the story of a passionate gypsy woman attempting to rid herself of a jealous old flame so that she could have a new affair with a bullfighter seemed like the plot of one of Nadine's romances. It was a marvelous performance. Vivian felt a bit strange to be wearing the same dress again within the same week, but Gregory insisted that she wear it, as he claimed he could not get enough of looking at her in it, which was of course nonsense, but was very flattering nonetheless. They attracted plenty of stares as they walked through the lobby during the intermission, but of course that was because of Gregory, who in his dark tuxedo evening jacket, brilliant white shirt, and white bow tie, and always flawlessly combed dark locks, readily outshone every other creature in the building. He seemed even taller than usual, but surely that was just an illusion. It got a bit warm in the second half of the performance, and Vivian briefly considered removing her small jacket, but then a look at Gregory made her stop. At first, she thought maybe he did not want to see her scrawny arms and small shoulders, but then she remembered how he had looked at her in the store, and she blushed all over again at the mere memory. All in all, it was another magical and unforgettable evening. After the performance, Gregory walked her up to her apartment door, where the fact that someone had finally fixed their hallway light was a pleasant surprise, and Vivian thanked him for taking her to the theater twice in a single week. He just shrugged. "If you want, we can live like this every week," he told her. "Well, at least while the theater season is still going. I will come and visit you again next Wednesday evening, unless you say otherwise. Now be good for me and close your eyes." "No," she said stubbornly. "I know what you're going to do. As always, you're going to disappear on me again." Well, all right then," he said to her. "I will toss a coin, and you can make a wish. Do you have a wish ready?" She thought for a moment, and then nodded. "Heads, it comes true. Tails, it comes true," he said. "It comes true either way. Now how does that work?" she asked him skeptically. But he had already pulled what looked to be a silver $50 coin from his pocket. "Are you ready with a wish?" he asked her playfully, and he balanced the shiny silver coin on his thumb for a moment before flipping it up into the air, sending it soaring toward the ceiling. She looked up and watched it as if in slow motion, moving through the air in a bright flash. Her eyes followed it as it fell back down, but to her surprise, Gregory was not there anymore to catch it, and the coin fell with a sharp ring on the tile floor of the hallway. That someone could vanish themselves from the spot in the few seconds of time that it took for a coin to be tossed in the air was ludicrous. In fact, she knew it was impossible. And yet he could do it, had just done it. She listened for his footsteps, but could hear none. She knew better than to call his name this time. She just sighed and said, "My wish did not come true after all." And then she opened the door to her apartment and stepped inside as quietly as she could, so as not to wake the apartment's other two sleeping residents. Despite the annoyance of having to have their time together always inevitably come to an end, Vivian was enjoying a blissful time in her life. With Gregory back, she had a true friend again, besides just her mother, and even aside from Gregory himself, going to a luxurious department store in the middle of her workday and trying on exorbitantly priced evening wear, and then going to evening theater performances as if it had always been her custom, was a fantastic pleasure. When she had been a girl, she had made fun of the unrealistic romance novels that Nadine had preferred, but now that she had long been a lonely and responsibility-laden woman, light-heartedness, adventure, extravagance, and beauty for its own sake thrilled her in a way that she deeply appreciated. What silliness to have had the kind of days that they had had in the last 2 weeks, and how wonderful that there was still silliness like that to be had in this world. And to have her be able to speak with Nadine again, a gift above all other gifts that he could possibly have given her, showed how well he understood her. Vivian had not imagined that any tendril of delight would have been able to withstand the deep frost that had frozen over her world for so long. But here it was, a sudden arrival of spring in her heart. In her gratitude, Vivian thought about what she could do for Gregory in return, something that he would like. She could not go out and buy him frivolities or theater tickets, and she knew that he could very well go out and buy himself anything that he might desire. But still there must be something that he would want. And then Sophie, who had been wearing her Easter bonnet around the apartment for days on end now, asked if they would be doing an Easter egg hunt, and Vivian had the idea to invite Gregory over for Easter lunch. The idea came to her, then she hesitated, because she knew that he would not eat anything. But then she remembered how glad he always was to be included in a group of people, like the Mullins, when they had all come around the Mullins dining table and had lunch. Yes, she would send a note to Wolf's store, inviting Gregory to come for lunch on Easter Sunday after Mass. It was only as she sat down to write the note that she recalled that she had also charitably invited Angela, the family-less war widow, ever seeking a replacement husband. That had been weeks ago, and Vivian had not really seen much of Angela in over a month, but surely it would be rude to cancel that invitation now. Oh, heavens, she thought. Angela's eyes will pop out of her head when she sees him. There's nothing in that size or color or exact likeness at any VFW afternoon tea social. It had the potential to be awkward. Maybe she should not invite him after all, or invite him for another occasion. "What are you writing?" asked Sophie, coming into the kitchen, for once at a slow pace, but that was only because she was carrying a glass full of water up to the very, very top. She was in socks, underwear, and a small shirt. Naturally, she was wearing her bonnet. "Oh, Sophie, what are you doing? Give that to me before you spill it," said Vivian, taking it and setting it on the table. "Why are you carrying this through the house?" "What are you writing?" repeated Sophie, clearly indicating that she would not answer any questions put to her until her question had been answered first. "I am writing a letter to Mr. Morgan," said Vivian. "To Goey-Goey," corrected Sophie. "Yes, to Gregory. Now run along and let me finish it," said Vivian. "Will he come to see me in my Easter bonnet?" asked Sophie. "Well, I don't know," began Vivian. "He will! Oh, he will, he will, he will!" cried Sophie, jumping up and down in the small space. Vivian sighed. And that is how Gregory ended up being invited to Easter lunch after all, an invitation which he quickly accepted by stopping by in person with a bouquet of daffodils tied with an orange ribbon. "There will be another lady visiting with us also, Gregory," Vivian told him. Gregory's smile broadened. "I always enjoy meeting new ladies," he said pleasantly. "Well, it will work out swimmingly, then," replied Vivian, feeling somehow brought down in spirits, but not being able to put a reason behind it. Shall you fake some kind of indigestion as your reason for not eating?" "No, I use a new excuse since the war. I usually say it is due to the inopportune timing of day, having to do with the new antibiotic regimen," Gregory said. Vivian rolled her eyes. Easter ham was expensive, and Vivian had all but ruled it out, but then a spring bonus at work suddenly made it possible, and with just about 2 non-eaters present, it was not even necessary to get a very large piece of ham. Besides glazed ham, the rest of the menu would consist of scalloped potatoes, green beans, cornbread, wine, and for dessert, a New Orleans-style bread pudding with bourbon sauce. "Shall I bring something?" asked Gregory, right on cue. "Sir, you are a mind reader," she told him. "Could you please bring us some bourbon whiskey?" Gregory broke into a laugh. "Nothing would please me better. Shall we all get tipsy together after lunch and sing bawdy old songs out loud?" "No, we shall cook with it," Vivian told him sternly. Gregory looked stricken. Cook with it?" he asked, aghast. "Oh, no." "Oh, yes. I want to make a bourbon sauce for the bread pudding," she explained. "Well, I suppose so," he said hollowly. But on his way out he was still muttering, "Cook with it? These crazy women folk." Vivian spent the next 2 days shopping and preparing for Easter lunch. Anyone who has ever entertained guests after a church service can appreciate the difficulties of returning home with hungry guests expecting food to be ready, yet the hostess has been away for a few hours herself, and everything has gone cold. Vivian and her mother had been cooking and cleaning since morning, but now everything needed to be reheated and final prepared. Angela had gone to church with them, but Vivian had not even asked Gregory if he wanted to go to church, suspecting that his answer would be no. Now Angela was sitting in the main room and playing with Sophie, while Vivian and her mother put on aprons and ran circles around the kitchen. The kitchen table had been moved out to the sofa area so that everyone would be able to sit in one room, which caused real challenges to food preparation in the kitchen due to extreme lack of table space. Vivian's night table had been brought into the kitchen, and she was now standing beside it, melting additional butter onto the dish of green beans, when a knock came on the door. "I'll get it," cried Vivian, nearly falling into the dish of scalloped potatoes sitting on the floor. She ran through the room and opened the door. There stood Gregory, holding an armful of flowers, a couple of brown packages, and wearing a light blue bow tie. He had never worn a bow tie other than a white one with an evening tailcoat, and he had never worn anything in so jaunty a color, not in all the time that she had ever known him. "Hello, you look festive," she said. "And you look radiant. Happy Easter," he told her, smiling a smile just for her. "Happy Easter. Come in," she said. "May I take your hat?" "First take this," he said, unloading the larger of his 2 bouquets. "And this one is for your mother." Vivian's mother came over, wiping her hands on her apron. She greeted Gregory and took the bouquet with thanks, and just in time because Sophie hurled herself at Gregory's pant legs just then, making loud squeals of delight. "One more moment, dear one," Gregory told her, reaching a hand down to pet her small head. "I believe you needed this for the cooking." He handed Vivian one of the brown paper packages and made a comical face, indicating how odious he found the mere thought of its fate. Vivian had to laugh. "Thank you kindly," she said. "Gooey, did you bring anything for me?" inquired Sophie impatiently. "Well, what do you think? Of course I did. Here, this one is for you." Gregory reached down the last of his items, the other brown paper package. Sophie sat down on the floor, tried to tear at the string, tried to tear off the paper, and finally resorted to using her small teeth. Gregory laughed. "If no one were watching me, I would do exactly the same, mademoiselle," he told her. "Sophie, you are drooling all over the place. Here, this will be better done with scissors," said Vivian. But Sophie would not relinquish her gift. Vivian set the flowers and bourbon down, found the scissors, bent down, and snipped through the string. "A new book!" exclaimed Sophie. "What do we say, Sophie?" her grandmother prompted her. "Thank you, Goey-Goey," shouted Sophie. "It is about a bunny," Gregory told her, bending down on one knee and tapping the cover of the book with his finger. "See him here, in the grass?" It was heartwarming, but also mildly annoying, how the entire world seemed to come to a standstill each time Gregory laid eyes on Sophie. "Gregory, come here for a moment before you begin with the bunny tales. I would like to introduce you to our other guest, Miss Angela Hubble." Angela had risen from the sofa and had turned to look at Gregory. Her expression matched exactly how Vivian had pictured it would look. Surprise, mixed with awe, mixed with blatant admiration. "Angela, this is Mr. Gregory Morgan, our longtime family friend from New Orleans." Gregory got up off of his knee, dusted off his trouser leg in a small gesture that Vivian knew implied ingrained habit rather than true concern over unclean floors, and he walked over to shake hands. "Madame, I am honored to make your acquaintance," he said, and he bowed formally over her hand. For a moment, Vivian thought he would kiss Angela's hand, but then he did not. Vivian exhaled. Why did he have to be so bizarrely formal about everything? Then she remembered that during his childhood in the days of Shakespeare, that was probably how everyone behaved all of the time. And then she shivered. Angela looked like she wanted to say something, but she was having difficulty getting a sentence out. Finally she settled for, "How nice," and gazed up at Gregory with a smile that made it plenty clear exactly what it was that she found so nice. Vivian had the wild notion to sit down between them on the sofa, but then she remembered the ham was still heating and needed to be checked on immediately, so she made her excuses and dashed to the kitchen, leaping back over the dish of scalloped potatoes, and then she strained her ears to hear what Gregory and Angela might say to each other. This is simply stupid behavior, the rational, well-known part of her head said, but another part simply wanted to growl, like Sophie did when anything was being taken away from her that she wanted to hold on to in that moment. Apparently, Sophie also disliked having Gregory's attention go elsewhere, because she loudly announced, "I am getting my bonnet," and then she raced across the small apartment to get it. "May I begin carrying things out to the table?" asked Vivian's mother, coming to stand beside her in the small kitchen. "At least these potatoes need to get to higher ground, and quickly. If Sophie tears through here, we are done for." Vivian agreed, and then the setting of the table began, pulling Angela away from Gregory just in time as Sophie reappeared, waving her arms like a dancing gypsy. "My bonnet, Goey-Goey, do you like it?" she asked him. "Oh, do I just," he replied with a laugh. "Your dancing is also nice and most elegant." Vivian looked over her shoulder and snorted a harumph. Sophie was stomping with her small feet as if crushing grapes underfoot, her long golden hair flying out from the bonnet in every direction at once. "Can we read my book now?" asked Sophie, coming to an abrupt halt. "Sophie, it is time for lunch first," said Vivian, bringing in the plate with the ham. "It's always time for lunch," complained Sophie. "I won't eat a bite." "Well, that would not be very elegant of you, dear," Angela told her. "If you become so thin and weak that you have no strength left, Mr. Morgan will not call you elegant any more." Angela gave Vivian a wink. Sophie seemed to seriously consider this, and then sat down unexpectedly at the table. "Sophie, let Grandmamma take your bonnet off. It is not a good idea to wear it at the lunch table," Vivian told her. Sophie pouted and predictably refused. Vivian sighed. If she wanted Sophie to do anything, from now on Vivian would probably have to get Gregory to make the request. How annoying. They all sat down at the table, and Vivian began to serve Easter lunch. "You, Mr. Morgan?" she asked, gesturing to his plate and creating the opening in the conversation for him to make his announcement that he was politely declining the meal. He looked up, and his eyes looked soft and almost sad. "Everything looks wonderful, Madame Vivian, but I am newly on antibiotics and have to time my meals in different hours, as I told you might be the case. I hope you have not counted on me in your cooking preparations." "I have not, but there is plenty of food to be had nonetheless," she said. "May I bring you a glass of water? I am assuming that, with the antibiotics, wine or whiskey is out of the question for you as well." She smiled, pleased with her cunning. He frowned and looked even sadder. "I suppose so," he said morosely. "Just the water, then." She bent her head down to her plate and felt so sorry for him. She made a note to herself to pour him some whiskey later, when no one else was looking. They all toasted to a happy Easter, Gregory with his water glass, and Sophie with her water cup, and then there was the sound of scraping utensils, as Angela said, "Mr. Morgan, tell us how you met Vivian and Mrs. Prevet in New Orleans. Was it at a Mardi Gras party? I think everyone who is not from New Orleans imagines that city to be one endless Mardi Gras celebration." Gregory took a small sip of his water and set the glass down in front of him, beside his empty plate. "No, we did not meet at a party. Rather, I ran Madame Vivian down in the street with my bicycle." "Oh, how horrible!" cried Angela. "Is he jesting?" she asked, turning to Vivian. "No, he is not. I still have the scars to prove it," said Vivian, cutting another piece of ham into small pieces for Sophie, who, despite not wanting to have lunch, was now wolfing down her remaining ham in silence. The cornbread was already reduced to just a small pile of crumbs on her plate. "Mr. Morgan inadvertently collided with Vivian on the sidewalk in front of the Basin Street train station," explained Vivian's mother. "Oh, but he was so thoughtful and considerate afterwards, bringing flowers every day to Vivian's hospital bed. It was easy then to forgive him." Angela giggled. "I can imagine so," she said. Vivian watched the ham being reduced into smaller cubes under her knife and wondered if her mother truly believed this version of things, if she had forgotten how she had forbidden Vivian to see Gregory, and what an inquisition she had put him under when he had at last showed up at their doorstep. No matter how many years passed, every moment that Vivian had had with Gregory was deeply etched in her memory, and she knew that their friendship had come about only after very unlikely beginnings, and it had not lasted without interruption since then, as her mother would have Angela believe. "Sophie, eat your green beans, please. There is more to good nutrition than just cornbread and meat," Vivian told her. "Goey isn't eating any green beans," pouted Sophie, pointing at Gregory's empty plate. "Mr. Morgan is taking a medicine that will not let him take lunch with us just now," said Vivian. "I am sure he knows all about good nutrition otherwise," she added, raising her eyebrows and looking at Gregory. His eyes had come up to catch her direct gaze. Sophie shoved her plate away toward the center of the small table, where it clanged dangerously into her water cup. "If he doesn't have to eat green beans, then I won't either," she stated. "Oh, now, little missus," said Gregory, pushing Sophie's chair closer to the table and bringing her plate back to her. "Here, I will eat a green bean, and then you will eat a green bean. Do we have a deal?" Vivian stopped cutting Sophie's ham and stared across the table. For the first time, in all of the time she had ever known him, Gregory picked up a fork, reached out his hand, delicately speared a long green bean onto it, and put it in his mouth. Then he appeared to chew thoughtfully. Sophie stared, and Vivian's mother stared. Only Angela continued eating as if nothing highly unusual was taking place. Vivian could not believe it. "Well, I am done with my green bean," Gregory announced. "It is your turn." He picked up another green bean and offered it to Sophie. "In your case, this might require 2 bites. See what you can do," he said. Sophie, eager to rise to what was now a challenge, stuffed the entire bean in 1 bite, and then chewed. Vivian's mother still stared at Gregory, as if expecting him to turn to vapor or some other unexpectedly awful thing. But Gregory seemed nonplussed. He picked up his water glass, drained it quickly, and then stood up. "I will get myself some more water," he said. "Please stay seated, Vivian." He walked over to the kitchen. Vivian had to clutch the edges of her chair to keep from running after him and seeing whether he spat the chewed-up bean out. He had to have done so. He had never so much as consumed a grain of rice in her presence before, and although he had never explained his diet to her, she somehow felt fairly certain that it did not include green beans. Gregory refilled his glass and returned to the table. "Ready for another one?" he asked Sophie, catching another bean on his fork. "Now you again," she pointed out to him. "It is my turn, you are quite correct. But my doctor would be most disappointed to learn that I have been eating lunch when he told me not to do so," said Gregory. "Perhaps we could leave my rule-breaking at just the 1 bean?" Sophie looked puzzled. "Does your doctor not know that green beans are healthy?" she asked. Angela laughed. "How very logical these small children are," she exclaimed, making a statement that only someone without children would make. "Green beans are healthy, but not when Mr. Morgan is taking his medicine. He will eat them later," explained Vivian, shifting Sophie's extra ham onto her plate, but feeling Gregory's gaze on her. Then he shifted his eyes to smile at Sophie. "I like the way you eat green beans, all in 1 bite. Very elegant. Can you do it again?" he asked. Sophie blushed from the praise, nodded, and devoured another green bean. "Mr. Morgan has a way with the ladies, seemingly even the very young ones," said Vivian sarcastically. The sure knowledge that she would have had to resort to threats to get the same result that Gregory was getting so smoothly made her irritated. "I do not doubt that at all," laughed Angela, wiping at the corners of her mouth with her napkin and smiling a sparkly, broad smile that actually made her look quite attractive. Many ladies might wish to be married to someone so charming. "But he is not married," said Sophie through a mouthful of beans. "Grandmama told me so." "Oh, now, Sophie, we do not say such things out loud in front of our guests," Vivian's mother reprimanded her, blushing, and Vivian felt a heat rise into her cheeks also. Gregory seemed to take it in stride. Navigating another of Sophie's beans onto the fork, he just said, "I once asked a lady to be my wife, but she would not have me. So then I gave up the whole idea of it, and figured I must not have what it takes." "What lady would have been so foolish as to say no to you?" asked Angela with surprise. Vivian stood up so fast she banged both of her knees on the underside of the small table. "I think I better go and start the bourbon sauce," she announced. Her face was on fire now, and her neck felt damp and sweaty. Gregory laughed. "I think the lady was probably wiser than I gave her credit for at the time," he was saying, as Vivian walked quickly away from the table. "When I am older, I will marry Goey-Goey," announced Sophie, still speaking with her mouth full of food. "When you are older, you will need to stop speaking with your mouth full, or the only kind of husband you will have is a caveman," retorted Vivian's mother. "What is a caveman?" asked Sophie with genuine curiosity. Vivian stood by the kitchen window and dabbed at her temple with the kitchen towel. Suddenly she could feel herself transported back to her old apartment, to the moment when Gregory had pulled a jeweler's box out of his pocket and had dazzled her eyes with the largest diamond ring that Vivian had ever seen up close up to that point in her life. Had she indeed been a fool not to marry him then? The fact that she had been a fool to ever marry Chip Westcott was beyond contention. What would my life be like today, she wondered, if I had said yes to Gregory then? Well, there would be no Sophie, and they would probably all still be in New Orleans, and she would not have to work either as an office girl, or as a sandwich maker, or stenographer, or even as a seamstress. Suddenly the image came to her of Gregory dressing her himself in elegant evening clothes, and then setting her down on a luxurious settee and feeding her green beans with a silver filigree-decorated fork. No, even all these years later it was impossible to imagine having said yes to his proposal, something that Angela, staring at him across the table with her mouth hanging open, could doubtless not begin to comprehend. Vivian sighed and turned to reach for the bourbon bottle so that she could begin her sauce. Out by the table, the meal was ending, and Angela and Vivian's mother began bringing dishes and bowls back into the small kitchen, where, of course, there was nowhere to set them. "Here, let me finish this sauce for you, Vivian," said Angela, "and you go and see Mr. Morgan and Sophie. They are reading The Runaway Bunny together, and they look just like a picture. Oh, and his voice as he reads. Wherever did you really find this man, Vivian?" Vivian handed Angela the wooden spoon, and she turned to look into the main room, where Gregory was sitting on the sofa, with Sophie, an arm about her small body, her bonnet finally off of her head and resting on the edge of the sofa's back. Gregory was reading, and Sophie was looking, mesmerized, at the pictures. "If you become a bird and fly away from me, I will be a tree that you come home to," he read out loud in his perfect voice. Vivian felt as if an arrow had just pierced her heart. "If you become a tree, I will become a little sailboat, and I will sail away from you," continued Gregory. "Did I run from you like this?" thought Vivian. Her eyes felt inexplicably damp suddenly, and she could not immediately make out why. Gregory kept reading and turning the pages, and Vivian felt tears splash down her cheeks. "And if you move away to New York, I will come after you and find you, little bunny," he might as well have read. "They are a tableau of happiness," said Angela. Then she looked at Vivian. "Oh, my dear, does it make you miss Sophie's father? There. Her father died a hero in service of his country. What could make you prouder to know than that?" Angela gave Vivian a hug, and Vivian mutely hugged her back. "Here, I will pour you a slug of bourbon. That will steady your nerves again." Angela found the bourbon bottle, uncorked it again, poured out a small amount, and handed it to Vivian, who only hesitated for a moment before drinking it in 2 gulps. "Oh, good heavens!" Vivian had not expected straight bourbon to be quite so potent. She broke into a coughing fit. Gregory had finished the book and looked up with concern at Vivian. "She attempted to sample the whiskey straight," explained Vivian's mother. Gregory laughed. "Serves her right. Leave that to the menfolk," he said. Vivian dabbed at her eyes with the kitchen towel, while Sophie ran off to the bedroom for something, and Vivian's mother and Angela proceeded to serve the bread pudding with bourbon sauce. Gregory came into the kitchen, ducking through the door frame, and then unfurling his full handsome height beside her, the light from the window glinting off of his dark, shiny hair. "Thank you for reading to Sophie," Vivian told him. "My pleasure," he said with a smile. And then he sniffed at the air. You smell heavenly when you smell of bourbon." Then he lowered his voice and said, "I recall another time when you smelled of bourbon. It was after you drank yourself tipsy at a bar and then came to my apartment. Do you remember?" Vivian nodded. "How embarrassing that you still remember that particular thing after all of these years," she said glumly. "You spent a good deal of time lying senseless in my arms while I whispered ardent promises of love to you. Of course I remember it. I will have to tell you about it sometime," he said in a low voice. And then he cleared his throat as if to purge the emotion from it, and he briefly touched her hair with his fingers before moving away again, while asking if there was anything else he could help with. There was no replying, because Sophie raced in and started pulling on his dark trouser leg while asking him to read the story again, this time to her stuffed toy bunny. Gregory placed a hand on top of Sophie's head and gave her a small pat before she squealed excitedly and raced away to the sofa. "You'd better not stay in here and attempt to finish the bottle this time," he said to Vivian, with a mischievous smile. And then dessert was eaten, and then coffee was served, and then Easter lunch was finished. It was out of the question to linger indoors much longer because Sophie, filled with energy and with sugar, began racing through the room at increasingly high speeds and colliding with its few furnishings at every turn, sliding underneath the table on her stomach and engaging in other similar unladylike behavior. She will have to marry a circus acrobat, or perhaps some traveling gypsy who will not mind her somersaulting across the floor after meal times, sighed Vivian's mother. "Angela, you are welcome to come with us, but I have to get Sophie outside for a bit," said Vivian. "Legrand, Legrand," Sophie kept repeating to herself as she stuffed her feet into her shoes. This was going to be the new word of the week, Vivian knew. Everything would now be Legrand, because Gregory had once said so. Angela said her goodbye, and Gregory did as well, saying that he had promised a visit to Wolf. Gregory asked if he could walk Angela somewhere, but she just giggled and told him she lived a mere few flights up the stairs. Vivian knew this, of course, but still the image of Gregory walking Angela to the subway or some other place, a bar perhaps, was already springing up in her mind and making her teeth threaten to grind together. "What is the problem here?" she asked herself in annoyance. "You just finished telling yourself how smart you were to have rejected him. Then why not let him walk wherever he wants, and with whomever he wants?" Oh, but if only he wasn't so beautiful to look at. It was always a kind of horror, even after all this time. She was still pouting as she got Sophie dressed, and then she took her to the park. Angela explained to me why we see so little of you at the park on the weekends anymore, said Edith coyly. It was a few weeks after Easter, and they were sitting on a bench at their nearest park, while Sophie was running around after little Robert and threatening to tear his hair out when she caught him. Robert, duly motivated by self-preservation, ran faster and faster. Angela told me about that handsome Mr. Morgan of yours. Old family friend, is it then? Vivian shaded her eyes and looked out into the sunlit park. Yes, it is, truthfully. He used to come calling on us in New Orleans. Angela told me he was breathtaking, that she had never seen a handsomer man, said Edith, and Vivian could feel she was trying to get her to make eye contact. Vivian stared stubbornly straight ahead into the greenery. Angela exaggerates. He's just averagely handsome, she said. Then she shouted to Sophie. Sophie, stop terrorizing Robert right this instant, or you will have to have a 5-minute punishment time on the bench. Edith seemed unconcerned at the moment about Robert's future survival. Angela told me that he looked very much taken with Sophie. This remark hit home. Yes, Gregory was very taken with Sophie. He had once been very taken with Vivian also, back when she had been age 6. Perhaps his unusual nature meant that he was really only able to allow his heart to feel connection with very small children, desireless creatures who still had their innocence fully intact. Vivian by no means imagined that Gregory had unseemly desires toward children, but it did strike her that his relationships with adults were limited, and that he was secretive, self-defensive, and almost afraid of them in a way that he never was with children. Perhaps he really only wanted to visit them now because of Sophie. Perhaps he would come to care more for Sophie than for Vivian, at least for the duration of time that she was a small child. Perhaps Vivian would have to go back in time and become a small child again for him to really love her. Vivian, are you listening? Asked Edith. I'm sorry, no, I was watching Sophie, lied Vivian. Sophie, punishment time on the bench, immediately. Vivian got up and pulled a screaming and indignant Sophie to the bench and sat her down, swallowing back the guilt at punishing Sophie primarily because it was expedient for her mother as a distraction. I'm sorry, you were saying? I was saying that if he is so handsome and so accepting of Sophie, you may have a real winner on your hands. It is hard to find a man who is willing to accept a woman with a small child, said Edith, as if it was any of her business. Yes, you may well be right, said Vivian ambivalently, falling silent for a moment, as if she was giving it consideration. Say, do you think we should take the children to the zoo again? Edith made a face. In the springtime? You know what all those animals are doing in the spring. She rolled her eyes. Don't we have enough problems as it is? Sophie wiped at her tear-stained face with her small hands. I want to go to the zoo and see what the animals are doing, she pouted. Oh, heavens above, thought Vivian. Edith leaned over to Sophie and petted her head. Now, there. Wouldn't you like to see the baby animals? They haven't been born yet, but they will be soon. We will go then. Will there really be baby animals, Mother? Sophie asked Vivian. Oh, let me go and tell Robert, she cried, and she jumped down off the bench and ran off, and Vivian let her, even though 5 minutes had not yet passed. Robert, seeing Sophie coming, stopped playing with his toy car in the grass, gave a small cry, and preemptively took off running. They saw less of Robert and a lot more of Gregory in parks that spring as the weather grew warmer and warmer. The trees began to bloom. The branches of the trees became laden with flowers, and Central Park turned into a magical landscape. Sophie and Gregory would race around until Sophie would grow tired, and then Gregory would find something to briefly hold her interest. A strangely shaped twig, or a leaf, or some such thing. And then he and Vivian would speak together. "It is beautiful here now. Why don't we spend all day here, every day?" he asked her on one occasion, as they stood together in the grass. The day was overcast but balmy and warm, the air full of the call of birds. "Well, because for one thing, I have to go to work," she told him, slightly irritated at his impracticality. "Do you dislike going to work?" he asked. "What is it like when you go?" "I keep asking about this, I know, but it is because the idea of a woman, and the mother of a small child nonetheless, working in a large company, is extremely foreign to me." She brushed a strand of hair back where the wind had blown it into her face. "You mean to say that this was not typical back in your youth?" she said, only slightly sarcastically. "It most certainly was not," he agreed. Then he reached out a hand to touch Vivian's elbow, and then he gently guided her over to a bench. "I confess, I'm not at all certain of what I think of women working alongside men in some large company all day. It seems like it would be degrading," he said as they sat down. She could see he meant it in earnest. "No, it isn't degrading," she replied. "In some ways it is rather nice. It is neat and mostly quiet and, well, elegant, I suppose. After the past jobs I have had, to be able to dress nicely and spend the workday sitting down in a comfortable chair is downright leisurely. People are polite to me. I learn new things all the time. Young men smile at me." "Which young men? Names and addresses, please, so that I can go and punch them in the nose," said Gregory with faux vehemence. Vivian laughed. Then she turned serious and looked closely at Gregory. "Would you like to visit me at my work?" she asked him. "Then you can see it for yourself." "Do they allow visitors in off the street?" he asked. "They do not, but I can get you in," she replied. "Would you come?" "Oh, would I ever? I live quite nearby, as you know, and I would love to see the inside of your office building. When I first came to New York, I made repeated visits to the Empire State Building. Just riding the elevator up those high floors and then looking out of the windows fascinated me. And then I saw the massive size of the city sprawled out around me, and fear would overtake me," he told her. "Fear of the hugeness of the city?" she asked. "Perhaps, but I interpreted it more as a fear that I would never, ever find you in a city this big, with no address, without even being certain if you were still here," he replied. "You mean you were really looking for me?" she asked him, turning her head so that they were looking into each other's eyes. "I have always been looking for you, don't you know?" he told her with a smile, reaching for her fingers with his and giving them a squeeze. "Gooey, gooey, my twig broke," complained Sophie, running up to them. "Excuse me, madame, but there appears to be some sort of crisis. Be assured I will return as soon as I am able," Gregory said, standing up and executing a deep, formal bow in front of Vivian that made her laugh again. A brilliant sun suddenly shone out from behind the clouds, and the park was filled with a radiance that brought out the lush green in every single blade of grass. Then, from seemingly out of nowhere, a strong, warm wind began blowing, and on the wind, 1,000,000 white petals were torn from the trees and began swirling through the air. Even without realizing it, Vivian stood up from the bench, her chest filling with a sense of awe and amazement. Sophie stopped running and dropped the pieces of her twig. "It's snowing! It's snowing!" she cried. Gregory came to stand near her, and Vivian joined them, and then the three of them stood close together, as the swirl of soft white petals filled the air around them. "It's not snow, it's flowers," cried Vivian. Gregory began to laugh, the happiest laugh that Vivian had ever heard him make, in his low and perfect tones, expressing a depth of contentment that made her spine tingle. "Whee!" cried Sophie, spinning herself around and around, with her arms straight out from her sides, petals landing in her hair and on her dress and all about her in the grass. Gregory picked her up and twirled her in his arms in the opposite direction. Vivian lifted up her hands, her palms open, and felt the small, brushing movements of the petals as they soared past, and suddenly every unhappiness or hurt that she had ever known seemed like it must have been in another lifetime. She was standing with her arms still lifted high when she felt Gregory's arm encircle her waist, and she turned, and there he was, holding Sophie on his other arm, and then they all embraced, with Sophie between them, the wind picking up the strands of her brilliantly blonde hair and making it flap like a flag against them. Vivian looked up and saw Gregory looking down at her, his expression soft as a baby deer's, and she felt tears well up in her eyes. Around them, the white petals swirled like the snow flurries in a snow globe, in this small world that suddenly held only the three of them. Then Sophie squirmed on Gregory's arm, and he set her down, and she ran euphorically through the grass in a wide circle, and he ran after her, and Vivian ran with them too, and the petals kept raining down on them, flying in swirling arcs over their heads, and filling the air with a wonderful scent. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the wind died down, and they all three looked up to see the last of the petals come sprinkling slowly and lifelessly out of the sky, the magic having been shut off. Vivian found herself having to work to catch her breath. "That was something else, don't you agree?" Gregory asked her. "I think back on every single one of those bone-chilling hours over the past winter months and imagine that this one single moment just about made up for them." "I've been in this park 100 times, Gregory, but you have made it into a magical place," Vivian sighed, still feeling the moistness in the corners of her eyes. She came to stand closer to him so that she could reach up and brush the small white petals off of his dark-suited shoulders. He smiled down at her. "I should admit in this moment that I do not in fact control the weather or nature's unexpected displays of glory, but it flatters me to think that you associate me with such godlike miracles. It was miraculous, wasn't it?" Sophie shuffled around them slowly, confused. "We can't build a snowman, can we?" she asked, still thinking that it must have been snow. "Not today, dear," Vivian told her. "Oh, that was wonderful," sighed Sophie, putting into words exactly how they all felt. And then they walked out of the park, through the petal-covered grass. They went home. Gregory bade them goodbye, and then Vivian lay awake into the night, still trying to understand the eternal mystery of how it was that Gregory did not age, and wondering how old he might really be. When she was with him, she was mostly too dazzled by him to remember to ask him to explain these mysteries, but when he was not there, her mind kept gnawing on them like a mouse on a piece of cheese. She did not doubt him, but how could such a thing be possible in this world, where no one else had ever heard of such things, except in fairy tales? What if she had said yes to his proposal of marriage? Would he have let her walk to the altar without telling her any of this? Or would he have then broken down and admitted the unusualness of his situation? Then she went even further back in her mind and tried to imagine how it had been when she had been the size of Sophie and Gregory had come to befriend her in the clinic at Metairie. What was that story again? A friend of his had died there. She would have to ask him to tell her once more. All she remembered of Metairie was being there, in that crib-like bed. Or perhaps this was not really her memory, but her mother's descriptions of it that she now recalled. How could she have known Gregory in those days, and then so thoroughly forgotten him? And to have met him over and over again 3 times now, under circumstances of extreme chance, it seemed as unlikely as the myth of an ageless, unchanging man. He told her he would explain about his age one day, but Vivian was not entirely sure she believed him, and she knew that he could not explain the way that life kept bringing them back onto each other's path. Vivian knew that she lacked much formal schooling, so probably there was something in the world of science that neatly explained all of this perfectly, only she had not studied it. Yes, that was it, certainly. All of this could be neatly explained by facts of which she was simply unaware. Satisfied for the moment, she fell asleep. They had decided on next Tuesday morning as the day for his visit to the Manhattan Life Insurance Company, and he came as promised, at 7:30 in the morning, to a donut shop near her office. Vivian thought it would be better to have him come and see the place at 8, just as the day got underway. As it was, he was bound to generate a large amount of undue attention. Fortunately, Vivian had a good friend in the head receptionist at the front desk, so together they arranged for him to gain admission to the premises. On the morning of his visit, Vivian, who always took the time to put herself together carefully before going to work, woke even earlier than usual and took her hair out of rollers before putting on her freshly ironed white blouse and then one of her 2 suits, the navy blue one with its matching skirt. Her only decoration was the brooch that she always wore that had been a gift from her mother, and then her faux pearl earrings. Somehow she had the thought that although Gregory might disapprove of a woman and mother working outside of the home, nonetheless, the world of the office would appeal to him, with its well-dressed people and its formal etiquette and its elegant office furnishings. She was actually quite proud of the kind of job that she had managed to work her way up to, and she was eager to show it off, as if perhaps it might elevate her further in his esteem, and that was a goal to be desired almost above all others. It was a great success for her to point to, this job of hers, and how much more impressive it would be to someone who was there when she had been a young girl, sewing in her mother's one-room apartment in Louisiana to make ends meet. After the excitement of readying herself, sleepy exhaustion overtook her once more by the time she reached the subway, and she was more than ready for coffee by the time she pushed her way through the door of the donut shop. He was already there, sitting at a table by the window, his face looking out into the daylight. He stood up when she approached and bowed his head in her direction. "Good morning, Madame Vivian," he said. "You look unspeakably beautiful, businesslike and efficient. Do join me." He gestured to the chair across from him. Vivian said hello and sat down, with her back to the window. She looked across the table at him, at this handsomest face in the whole world, and she fell into his gaze, which was lit up by the morning sun, and which revealed a pair of eyes of lighter color than she had seen on him in a very long time. A vague memory of sitting across from him for the first time in the Café du Monde popped into her mind. They smiled at each other, and then Vivian said, "You know, they don't come around here to ask for your order. We will have to go to the counter and tell them what we want." Gregory looked surprised. "Oh, very well then. It is a good thing you told me, or we might have had a long morning of it here. A hot chocolate and a donut for you?" Vivian gave him a wry look. "Mr. Morgan, I am a grown woman now. Hot chocolate is delicious, but it is too fattening. A coffee and a small donut, please." He had stood up from his chair, but now paused. "A black coffee? Surely you are not as grown up as all that." "Well, no, with cream and sugar, but I really shouldn't, because I must watch my figure," she replied. "You watch your figure? That is the daftest thing I have heard in some time," he said. "If your figure needs watching, please just call me. It is one of the services that I would be most eager to render." He grinned, and that in turn made Vivian smile back. Soon he was back, and he put her items in front of her. "Well, thank you, Gregory," she said, taking a careful sip of her coffee, and then picking up her donut. "So about this upcoming visit, it will have to be a quick one, I'm afraid, because—" Then she stopped speaking, because she could see that he was suddenly looking at her with a horrified expression. "What? What is it?" As she watched, Gregory's expression went from horror to humor, and then to bright joy. "That," he said, pointing to Vivian's donut, which she was dunking into her coffee. "That is the vilest sight I have seen in some time. What in the world do you call that gesture?" "What gesture?" she asked, completely confused. "That," he said. "You are sticking your donut into your coffee as if to wash off some kind of dirt from it." Vivian looked down. "Oh, this is called dunking. I'm dunking my donut into my coffee. Is it a problem?" "Where did you pick up that disgusting habit?" he asked, but his face, at odds with his words, was full of good humor. Nonetheless, Vivian squirmed. She hated displeasing him, and was surprised at criticism from him on anything, much less something as small and unimportant as this, as fancy as she tried to be. "Well, as a matter of fact, a nice boy at the automat taught me this once," she said grumpily. Gregory began to laugh out loud. "Why are you laughing?" she asked him. "Because I am so very happy," he replied. "Never in all the time that I have known you have I ever believed a gesture of yours to be anything other than graceful and almost goddess-like, and I was beginning to wonder if you were a real person. It delights me more than you could possibly know to find something about you that is imperfect." Vivian put down the remainder of her donut and blushed uncomfortably. "I feel very awkward now," she said uneasily. Gregory reached out and touched her hand with his fingers. "Do not feel that. It is charming to me, and it is also humanizing, in a way that I need to feel with you. I have spent so much time worshipping you that I sometimes forget you are real. It puts a barrier between us, I know, but I cannot help worshipping you most of the time. Vivian kept blushing, but suddenly no longer felt uncomfortable. His radiance was making the entire shop vanish around them, and she looked into his eyes now and saw nothing but him. Then she gave a sigh and looked back down at her donut. So I shouldn't? Oh, no, you must. I insist, he said with a wide smile. Please continue dunking, as you called it, or I shall have to do it for you and feed it to you. I imagine there is some kind of added deliciousness from administering this gesture. Vivian picked her donut back up and dunked its very end, just quickly, into her coffee. Yes, she said, it fills the donut with coffee flavor, but if you hold it submerged too long, it crumbles into the coffee and disappears to the bottom of your mug. It sounds complicated, he said. I think this is similar to when soldiers used to throw week-old bread or hardtack into gruel or stew in hopes of making it soft enough again to be edible. I may have done that, come to think of it. In which war? She asked him, putting the bite of donut into her mouth. Ah, yes. That is the question, isn't it? I will tell you, but not now. We have a mere 10 minutes to 8 o'clock, he said, pulling out his watch. Vivian quickly finished her breakfast, and then they hurried out to the street to walk across to the front doors of the Manhattan Life Insurance Company. Everything worked as planned, and Gregory was admitted past the reception desk, although not without the sub-receptionist's eyes almost starting from their sockets. Vivian sighed. It was never going to be easy smuggling in a more than 6-foot-tall, handsome man under dubious pretenses. Gregory seemed not to mind at all. His eyes went wide at the inside of the building and all of the people and the bustle of the workday getting started. He seemed like a boy, eager to experience this new and strange thing and to understand its complex inner workings. They took the elevator to Vivian's desk, and she pointed at its small and insignificant size. No doubt you were expecting something a bit more grand. I used to have a very nice desk, about twice this size, when I was the private secretary to the company president at the Carlisle Addressing Machine Company, she said, by way of apology. She spoke in a whisper to him, but people still looked up and stared. Why did you leave there? Gregory whispered back to her. They were going out of business, she said simply. I see. So what exactly do you do here? He asked her. Well, the insurance contracts are done up, and then they are filed with the contract records office, with the head librarian, and then claims come in, and that is where I go in and repull the contract and review it and prepare it for the claims filing and processing work that the fully trained claims specialist does, she explained, walking him back out toward the elevator. Here, I will show you one of the conference rooms. The view from the one on the second-to-highest floor is quite spectacular. Gregory followed her through the mailroom area on Vivian's floor and into the elevator. So, you prepare paperwork for claims specialists? Would you not want to become a claims specialist yourself? He asked her. It sounds like that would be even more prestigious. Well, as it happens, I do want to become a claims specialist one day. Here, let me show you the conference room, and then I will show you something else, namely the most expensive yet hideous painting you have ever seen, she told him. Well, that sounds intriguing, he said. Lead on. They sneaked unseen into the empty conference room, and Vivian shivered. We need to hurry. I could get into very big trouble, Gregory. Gregory remained entirely calm. If anyone comes in, you have just walked in and asked me what I want, and I told you I'm here to see James McGinley. "How do you know James McGinley?" she asked him, puzzled. "I pulled his business card off of his mail slot in passing," Gregory said, "just in case I needed to give an alibi to explain my presence. Please return it to the mailroom after I go." Vivian was impressed. She had never even noticed. Him and his lightning-quick, silent movements. "You know," she told him, "this reminds me of a certain moment when you once produced a pin on minimal notice to distract my mother from the fact that we were standing much too close together. Do you remember?" "Oddly, yes, I do," he said. Then he walked along the windows and admired the view. "This is nice. It almost makes me consider taking up some kind of employment again." "You would have to be a high-level manager to have meetings in here," she told him. "And then I do believe they sit in here and discuss insurance matters." "Yes, I see. I had forgotten about that," he said, making a face. Vivian laughed quietly, and then they hurried out. They rode the elevator down and got out at the floor of the personnel department. There were many people hurrying about on this floor, and of course, almost all of them stopped to give Gregory a look, which made Vivian nervous. They walked down the corridor to a painting that was hanging next to the office of the director of personnel. It was a large, all-gray canvas covered in a few large, yellowish-green blotches that in turn were covered with small orange dots. "What is it?" asked Gregory. "It looks like something hideous seen through a microscope, or something perhaps being consumed by small insects." "The painting name is given here beside it and says only, 'Mustard Seeds, Group 7. Ugly, right?" she asked. "Grotesque," he agreed. "Group 7. Do you suppose this means that there are 6 other such paintings blighting other offices elsewhere?" "I cannot say for certain," replied Vivian, "but I overheard one of the girls say that this painting is from a very popular modern artist and cost almost $1 million. "Do you believe that?" asked Gregory skeptically. "I look at this and would think that most people would not even hang this in a bathroom. And to think that I gave up on painting after my failed landscape canvas. Who could have known that expectations would one day sink so low? I wonder now if I should have tried to sell my dreadful painting that I had hung in the horse barn out at Temps-le-Désiré." They turned to walk back to the elevators, and on the way, Vivian turned off into a small area where office supplies were laid out. "The jobs board is in here," she explained. "I always look to see if there are any new postings to apply for." "Oh, look at this," said Vivian. She pointed to a sign that read, "Job posting for the position of claims specialist, Level A." Gregory stopped, and they both read it carefully. "Is this not the position that you said you wanted?" he asked her. "It is. It is exactly the position I said I wanted. I do much of this job already now, but am paid only a fraction of what this job would pay," she explained. "Oh, so this is about the money?" he asked, looking confused. She looked at him and wondered for a moment if he was making a jest of some kind. "Of course it is about the money," she said to him in a low voice. "What did you think? That I would seek this position out of my love for insurance work?" He looked hurt. "I'm sorry," he said. "I have never really worked for money, so I do not really have a good understanding of how it all works. I feel foolish now. Maybe a bit like you caught dunking." Then he smiled, and then she relented and smiled back. "Come, let's go," she said, and they went back to the elevators, which they rode downstairs to the ground floor, so that Vivian could walk Gregory back out to the street. The morning was sunny and warm as they stood together and talked. Thank you, that was a most enjoyable and fascinating, if brief, visit. Now when you're at work all day, I know what to imagine as your backdrop, he said. Then, changing to a gently probing tone, he asked, So, about this position, what exactly would you do with more money? I have a small child and an independent household to run, she shrugged. Money seems to vanish into the daily necessities like a bucket of water thrown out over the desert. If I ever had any extra money, I could get Sophie her own bed to sleep in, or I could take her to the ocean for a few days, or maybe I could even get us a larger place to rent. It just so happens that a larger apartment has become available in our building, but with my current salary, I could never afford the rent. My mother's sewing is a big help, and I also still sew whenever I can, but honestly, I cannot work every waking moment, which is what motherhood and 2 jobs already really means. You know that my mother and I have always struggled to make ends meet, and that hasn't changed. Gregory looked away down the street, his expression thoughtful. I never really thought about it, he said. Money is an interesting thing. I had always thought money to be almost useless, but here you are telling me quite the opposite. Money is what gets you almost everything you need, said Vivian. Oh, if we could afford a larger place and move to that apartment upstairs, that could be a dream come true. My mother might not even have to sleep on a sofa anymore. How strange. I have known women who dreamed of castles and country estates and stately homes. And here you are saying that a larger apartment would be a dream come true. Why not dream bigger, as they say? He asked her. She looked down. I prefer to be more realistic, and I dislike disappointment. So you're going to apply for this job then? He asked. I don't know. I probably will. There's no harm in trying, is there? She asked. No, there is not. I think you should apply. Let me know how it turns out, he said. Keep your fingers crossed for me, she told him. The next day was Wednesday, so Gregory came by in the evening to pay them his weekly call. Sophie raced to the door and threw herself at his legs, as had become her ladylike custom. Her next polite act was always to inquire if he had brought her anything. He always seemed to have a flower ready to hand down to her from his suit lapel, but other days he also had some other small thing, and often that other thing was a book. This child needs to have a bookshelf full of books, he insisted. How else is her little mind supposed to grow if it has no ideas to grow upon? Grandmamma is teaching her how to put the utensils away and how to sort buttons and ribbons and such, said Vivian defensively, and I do read to her just about every night. Madame, we are looking to work our way up to Cyrano and Shakespeare one day, he said, with a twinkle in his eye. Vivian tried to see the humor in that, but was surprised to discover that it felt more like an irritant to her. Why was that exactly? Well, Sophie would get older and grow and grow. Vivian would age, and Gregory would look exactly like he did right now, while passionately reading Cyrano to Sophie. It was enough to make anyone feel sick. Vivian shuddered and tried to brush the unpalatable thought aside. "What book is it today, Goey-Goey?" asked Sophie, bouncing up and down in one place like an impatient flea, while Vivian's mother came and also greeted Gregory. "It is a book about a small duckling. Here is its picture." Gregory knelt down on one knee to bring himself closer to Sophie's height, and he pointed at the picture in the book. "I want to read it now!" cried Sophie impatiently. "Now, Sophie, you know the rules," admonished Vivian, taking the book from Gregory. You need to be in your nightgown and with your teeth brushed and your face washed before reading time can start." Sophie replied by dashing off to the bathroom without any further protest, Wednesday nights being the only nights when this was consistently the case. It was enough to drive a mother batty. Then, when Sophie was all set and propped up in bed against all of her pillows, Gregory came in and read to her. Vivian always started by standing just outside the door and listening, but then she would feel herself start to go all melty and lightheaded from focusing so intently on Gregory's fantastic voice, and that made her feel foolish and embarrassed, so then she would go into the kitchen and finish the washing up after dinner. Gregory would come there to tell her when he and Sophie had finished reading, and then Vivian would go in and say goodnight and tuck Sophie in. Vivian's mother would have her sewing out by that time, and the three of them would sit down together on the sofa and armchair and talk about the week. "How was your visit to Vivian's office yesterday?" Vivian's mother asked Gregory. Vivian had already told her mother all about it, but now it was Gregory's turn to give his version of things. Gregory leaned back onto the sofa as he began speaking, his long torso disappearing into the dark gray of his vest. Fewer and fewer men were still wearing suit vests, Vivian thought. She had once wondered what made Gregory such a formal traditionalist, but now she realized that it might not be a love of tradition at all, but perhaps just a lack of awareness that time had moved on. How many changes of fashion had Gregory seen in his years, she thought. One probably couldn't be bothered to change with all of them. He had had this style that he had right now for as long as she had known him, or at least that she could remember knowing him. How long was it possible to go on before an upgrade in one's appearance became unavoidable? No one could go around in the street these days in Revolutionary War knee pants and stockings, surely, without being mistaken for a costume ball attendee. And what about those long gray wigs that men had once worn? Had Gregory ever worn one of those? Vivian tried to imagine him in gray locks down to his mid-back. Oh, horror! Surely he had never. "What do you think of that, Vivian?" her mother asked her. "Huh? What? I mean, beg your pardon. My mind wandered off for a bit there. What are we speaking about?" asked Vivian awkwardly, trying to stifle a yawn. "I'm so tired," she thought. She loved every one of Gregory's visits, but Wednesdays were very long days in her world. "We were discussing the merits and drawbacks of having women in the workforce, right alongside men," said her mother. "Oh, I see. Well, I think that it must be luxurious to be able to be at home and to run the household and all of that, but many women simply have to work. Not all of the women who lost their husbands in the war have remarried, and moreover many of them began working before the war even ended, so that has become what fills their life. I do not think that working for an insurance company is beneath my dignity, and the men are, for the most part, respectful to women. I'm not going to think now of the young insurance salesmen who come in for trainings and look at me as if I were a cut of prime meat in a butcher's display window," she thought. "I'm not going to think now of the old lecher in accounting who has pinched the rear end of every female employee in the company." "You do not feel at all that women are treated with disadvantage in your line of work?" asked Gregory. "No, on the whole I do not. I think everyone is treated well," said Vivian. Compared to life cleaning hotel toilets or her other degrading jobs, this was a blemish-free oasis of employment that she had now, after all. Vivian had reason to think back on this conversation again a few weeks later, as she was coming out of the personnel department. I'm sorry, Miss Westcott, but you see, well, I should not be telling you this, but as I find you charming, I shall explain to you how this decision was made," the personnel manager had said to her. "You and Mr. Dickerson were the final 2 candidates under consideration for this position of Claims Specialist Level A, and although I personally agree with your assessment that you are perhaps better qualified, as you have a more extensive resume in office work, we have given the position to Mr. Dickerson. He is a former soldier and the breadwinner for his family, so obviously he needs this job more than you do." Vivian gritted her teeth together so hard she thought she might crack their enamel. "You asshole," she thought furiously. "I am the breadwinner for my family. I support 3 people with my salary. I have a small child and nobody to take care of me, so obviously I need this job. My mother sleeps on a sofa, and if she didn't, I would have no job at all, because I would have no one to watch my child." Then she looked down at her shaking hands, which were clenched on her lap so that the knuckles were bright white, and she realized that she had never documented Sophie's existence with any of her employers, and she wore no wedding band, so the personnel manager must think she was a young, single girl. For a moment she wondered if she should degrade herself by sobbing to him that she was a war widow and that she had a young daughter to support at home. The thought of playing the war widow was always repulsive to her, but the higher paycheck would surely make it worth the brief discomfort. But then she realized that the decision was already made, and that, for all she knew, this dutiful patriot and father, Mr. Dickerson, was already getting the nameplate for his desk engraved, so it would be merely degrading herself for no useful gain. She stood up. "I appreciate your consideration, then," she said angrily. He stood up and showed her out the door. "I sense your disappointment, but am glad you understand." Vivian stomped back to her desk, told her nearest desk mates that she had a pounding headache, and then she dashed out into the street, where for a solid hour she thought angrily about kicking things. Then she came back to her desk, her indecipherable mask of professional cool back in place, and she resumed her work due for that day. "You cannot break me, you evil and unjust people," she thought to herself. "I will not give you that satisfaction. I may not have served in the war like your amazing Mr. Dickerson, but I'm tougher than all of you, and I have lived through my own war. Try being torn away from home, being repeatedly handed death instead of live children, slaving away every day and night, and assuming no kind of work is beneath your dignity, and on top of it all, being married to a selfish drunkard and criminal who hates you. What good and easy thing has ever come to me? There has been nothing. My whole life has been uphill, and I'm not going to crack now over a small bump in the road like Mr. Dickerson and all the bigoted assholes in the personnel department." It wasn't until she was on the subway and heading home that she realized that in her rage she had left out something, that there was something good that had come to her once without any of her effort, and that was Gregory. She sighed and clutched her handbag tighter to her chest to keep from awkwardly crying in public. That following Wednesday, she confessed to Gregory that she had not gotten the job. "You know, when a man is a breadwinner for his family, he needs the job more than a woman does," she explained, trying to hold in the bitterness so that she could see how he would respond. She knew he was at least partly opposed to women working as she did, so here was his chance to say, "I told you so." Gregory said nothing of the kind. Instead, he frowned deeply. "I am a traditional Southern man," he said. "Women working alongside men in large companies strikes me as unusual. However, having agreed to let them work there, and having given them positions in which to prove their skills, it now strikes me as extremely rude and bigoted to keep women on small pays, and to not let them have the same chances at advancement and promotion as their male colleagues. And I won't even talk about how unchivalrous it all is." "What would a chivalrous man do in such an environment?" asked Vivian's mother with curiosity. "I confess I do not know what chivalry should look like in such a strange and unusual context. In my case, I would probably make the error in the opposite direction, and promote all of the women ahead of the men, in the interests of old-fashioned gentlemanliness," admitted Gregory. Vivian sighed. "Never run a large insurance company, Gregory," she told him. "Something tells me that you do not have what it takes." "Something tells me that you are right," he agreed humbly. "Well, do not be too disappointed. Something else will work out. Maybe something even better." On Saturday evening, Gregory came to visit again. It was just the two of them and Sophie this time, since Edith's mother was visiting, and she and Vivian's mother had become friendly and had gone out to see a movie together. Sophie was in bed at last, and Vivian sat down with Gregory on the sofa. "Your memory seems much improved over when I knew you last," she said to him. "So far you have always come when you say you will." Gregory waved with his hand. "Don't believe that. I still write everything down in my notebook. My memory is only better with you. The rest of my days are still filled with intense note-taking." Vivian pulled out her sewing basket, then hesitated. "I know you want me to wait, but I want to get to hear your story," she said, changing subjects. "Sometimes I want it so much, I think that if you told me, then even if you went away again, I could somehow go on, knowing this about you. I want to know you better, to understand you better. I need to hear it." He frowned. "Do you think I will go away again? Is that what you are worried about?" She ignored his question. "I want to know your real age. When will you tell me?" "Soon. I will tell you soon. Honestly, I will. I'm not lying to you," he said. But his face had gone a shade paler, as it always did, when she mentioned his past. "Why not tell me now?" she asked him. He looked off toward the kitchen. "I suppose that a part of me is always afraid that you will leave me or reject me if I tell you," he said. "It is similar to your fear. You think I will leave, and I think you will throw me out." "Oh, don't be ridiculous. You know I would never do that," she said. "All right, don't tell me your whole story yet, but can you at least tell me a little about your past?" "Well, you know I was a handful as a small boy," he told her. "Who was your first love?" she asked casually, but really thinking of the beautiful woman in the picture she had once seen on his dresser. She thought he might hesitate, but he was quick to answer. "Why, the Blessed Virgin. I was a good Catholic boy, what can I say? I got into great trouble once for telling everyone that I saw her, that she came to sit with me on the edge of my bed." Vivian sat up straighter. "Did she come?" she asked him, awed and skeptical at the same time. "She did. I saw her just the same way that I see you now," Gregory said, looking into Vivian's eyes and making her feel slightly dizzy. "What did she look like?" Vivian asked. He shrugged. "Beautiful, dressed in blue, just the same as she looks in church." "Why did you get in trouble for saying you saw her?" she inquired. "I was what was then called a fanciful child. and this may have been acceptable in a daughter, but not in a son, and my father never forgave me for it. After I said I saw the Blessed Virgin, he gave me a whipping for lying, and for being blasphemous, and for having an uncontrolled imagination, and for not knowing fantasy from reality. My mother came to me later and asked me if it had been true, and when I told her that I really had seen her, my mother went away again, but I saw tears in her eyes. I don't know what that meant. The point is that I learned not to speak about things that I saw or heard that I did not think others could see or hear. It was just easier that way, and eventually those strange experiences lessened and went away. Vivian recalled how Gregory had prayed for her leg to be healed, and how she had always believed that he had worked a miracle for her. Was this the same quality in him, coming through in this story, she wondered. "What is the passage of time like for you?" she asked him then, expanding the subject. "Well, I recall some things very clearly, and others only barely," he said. They were sitting very close together now, and her pulse started to speed up. She could feel as if a significant secret was about to be spoken out loud, as if his next words would change everything. He reached a hand over to push a strand of hair out of her face, and she felt herself blush. Gregory, she thought, her heart full of him suddenly. "I would say," he began. But then in the next instant, the apartment door banged open and her mother stepped through it. Gregory dropped his hand away and shot up as if someone had attempted to hand him live coals. "Oh, hello, Mr. Morgan. I had not expected to still find you here. It has become quite late," said Vivian's mother. Gregory pulled out his pocket watch, probably more for something to do to cover up the awkwardness of the moment, rather than because of a sincere interest in the time, thought Vivian. "Yes, how right you are. We have become lost in conversation," he said. "Good night, madame. Good night, Vivian. I'm going now." Vivian walked him to the door. "You are frowning. What is it that you are thinking?" she asked him softly as she led him out. "I'm thinking that you were right, and that this apartment is far too small for 3 or 4 people," he said brusquely, eyebrows furrowed, and then he was gone.
Je ne veux pas travailler, je ne veux pas déjeuner, je veux seulement oublier, et puis je fume. Déjà j'ai connu le parfum de l'amour, 1 million de roses n'embaumerait pas autant. Maintenant une seule fleur dans mes ans